अगले सेशन के लिए मैं स्टेज पे इस्मत आरा और कुणाल मजूमदार को बुलाना चाहूँगा। सेशन का टॉपिक बहुत इंटरेस्टिंग है और काफ़ी लोग हम लोग जो ऑनलाइन जाते हैं इस चीज़ को देखते हैं, ये सब कुछ चलता रहता है। बीइंग अ वुमेन जर्नलिस्ट एंड फेसिंग ऑनलाइन हेट। तो इस्मत आरा एंड कुणाल मजूमदार का स्टेज पर स्वागत है।
So this girl was very young, and she said thank you for doing this, and that is when I felt like, okay, it was important, and I'm glad that I took that step.
Definitely, it was something, and I recall talking to at least 7, 8 of the people who were on this list, all journalists from Kashmir to the entire mainland. And I remember how many journalists, in spite of the fact that they were journalists, were not willing to come out and speak because, of course, something like this brings about a shame. I mean, it's very difficult, and I keep telling this to my male colleagues and friends. Until unless you're a woman, you would never understand what does it feel to be a woman in 2020 India. So I think it was really brave of you, and I think we should really give a round of applause to Ismat for having done that, because in many sense I think what you did was required to be done, and not everybody would have the guts to do it. Now, talking about, so you know what this this incident showed was that there is a tracking mechanism.
Correct.
We always thought that these trolls are anonymous. But are they anonymous? Because Wire, your former organization, then did an investigative piece which showed that there is an app called TechFog, which is being used to kind of specifically target journalists and specifically target women journalists.
Correct.
And they've had a list of women journalists, and you were one of them.
Correct.
Could you tell me a little bit, because you were within the organization, how did this whole thing evolve?
Correct. So even if we look at the bully by incident, when we look at it, we find that it was not a random crime, you know, it was not random. There were people who literally made that, selected the women, they selected a list of women, they selected more than 100 women who are, and a lot of them are like prominent, you know, women in media, they're actors and they're politicians and activists, women like that. So there was one person who made a list of all of these women.
I'm sorry, and also women who are like, for example, Rana Safvi, who
Correct.
is like 70, 60 plus, I think, and who's a historian. So they didn't spare. I mean, it's literally like underage to
and there were other elderly women also involved. So basically, like when you look at that, you do realize that, you know, there is somebody behind this who is actually making a list of women who need to be there on the posters. Then there is somebody sitting there designing the posters, writing on top of each of our photographs, saying that this is your bully by deal of the day. You know, so there's somebody who's doing that. Somebody who's going to Twitter and then uploading a link of that, you know, obnoxious website to actually, you know, propagate and to actually like let more people know about it. So that was, so I think it's of course not random at all. It is like trolling happens at a very organized level. And even the bully by investigation that happened, and the I don't know if you guys are aware, but there are 2 investigations happening in the bully by case. One is by the Delhi police and the other is by the Mumbai police. So the Mumbai police in their charge sheet have actually pointed out to a larger sort of power behind this, while the Delhi police hasn't really done that. They have named, you know, certain people and they have arrested them and built that charge sheet. But Mumbai police actually pointed to the fact that, you know, this is not an random thing. There is somebody who's behind this. So yeah, like I think that is something worth looking at.
Definitely. Before we come to the safety aspect, and we were told that there are many women aspiring journalists in the audience who'd like to really know about the safety aspect and precautions, let's just also speak a little bit about how this online threat translates into offline. You know, it's at one point, I remember, again, much early in my career, when we had trolling, we used to just think that it's just limited to online. You know, ye phone band kar do, farak nahi padta, kind of a thing. But that's no more the case. You know, before I ask Ismat to share her experience, I'd like to point out part of the research that we did at CPJ. We found that there were journalists who were covering both the two riots that took place in Delhi, one in Northeast and then in Jahangirpuri, who were identified offline while they went to cover post-riot incidences, or when the riots were taking place, or when there were events organized by the Hindu right-wing organizations, fringe or otherwise. Nowadays, even the word fringe is weird. It's the way you have redefined secularism or pseudo. So we found that journalists were called out. The organizers were calling out names. For example, if somebody is sitting there, I called out XYZ, I know you're sitting there, blah, blah, and all of that. That's one phenomena. The other phenomena is this ID card. You know, at one point, we used to really wanted to have a press ID card. It used to be something that we would like be with pride, had given us, you know, Mr. Thakur just now spoke about access journalism. We thought press card hone se humko access mil jayega. You know, we can go here, we can manage the police, the traffic cops, and etc., etc. But now that ID card a funda in the neck, because you're looking at the ID card and you're realizing who the individual is, and unfortunately what's the religion of that individual. Correct. And I remember, I think it was some journalists from Caravan as well as from Wire and Quint, who had to, I forget who the specific journalist was, who had to actually give a Hindu name when asked what the person's name is in order to escape. You were also attacked. Could you share what happened in a situation like this?
I'm happy that you mentioned the ID card thing, because during the Delhi riots, I thought that my ID card would actually get me killed, you know, because it was a very sensitive area. I was in Mojpur covering the riots. And I, of course, like that was for the first time I realized that I haven't got the training that I needed to get in order to report this kind of a thing, you know. So I was there, and of course, there was riots everywhere, like tires burning, petrol stations were, you know, on fire, houses were on fire, and people were out with, you know, weapons. So amid all of that, I think that is when I realized that I'm walking towards, I'm trying to escape the situation. I've realized by now that, you know, it's too dangerous for me to be here and report. So I'm trying to escape from the situation, and that's when a group of men come to me and ask me, ki aap kya kar rahe ho yahan pe? You know, and in that moment, I sort of froze, and I immediately came up with a false reason. I said that I had come to meet my friend. I couldn't have told them that I was a journalist, because usse ek din pehle, just one day before, I remember one of my friends, you know, who works at NDTV, he was basically attacked by the rioters, and you know, his friend had to actually tell the rioters that he's not a Muslim man, that he's a Hindu person, so usko chhod do. You know, that is what happened. And of course, at that point, I froze, and then I said that I had to meet my friend. But these guys did not buy it. And for the next 20 minutes, I kept walking in these lanes of Mojpur, trying to escape that mob which was, you know, following me. And in my head, my thought was that, where is my ID card? I need to hide my ID card as deep in my bag as I can, you know, because that was what was going on in my head at that time. What if, you know, my name is found out? And I thought I would die. Like that was one of the most scary events that I've covered. So I think with the Delhi riots, like that happened with a lot of other journalists as well. And when you're a woman, there is of course an additional threat, you know, to your safety, in the sense that there is a risk of sexual harassment, sexual abuse. With men, I think men were also, of course, very vulnerable at that time. But as women, it was way too dangerous. That's what I felt.
Let's talk a little bit about safety. You know, unfortunately, in Indian newsrooms, that's a topic that we rarely talk about. I mean, again, I remember when I entered newsroom, there was a lot of bravado डेड बॉडी देखने का एक ब्रवाडो था, यार मैं तो मॉग में गया, ऐसे मैंने एक डेड बॉडी देख दिया, या राइट्स में गया, या ऑल ऑफ दैट. But that's not something that's bravado, because it leaves a lot of mental trauma. And then there is this whole thing about how do you keep safe. You know, part of the work that we at CPJ do, we talk about a lot of safety. You know, how do you digitally stay safe? How do you physically stay safe? How do you psychologically stay safe? You know, whether that's covering elections, riots, etc., etc. What are, I mean, were you aware of any of these safety mechanism, A? And B, once these incidences started happening, what kind of help did you try to reach out for, or if there does any such help exist in Indian newsrooms?
Correct. So I think initially when the trolling started, I think at that point I was really affected and impacted by it, because that was a phase where I was just starting out, and I thought I was going to, you know, report on good stories and make a good career and all of that. I did not really figure in the trolling and the harassment. But then when it started, it really impacted me. After a point, you know, when I started thinking about who are these trolls, you know, what is their background? Like, why are they doing it? What is their intent? When I started rationalizing with my own, when I started rationalizing and when I started thinking about it, it sort of became smaller. You know, it became smaller because I realized that their intent was just one. Their intent was to just silence women who are trying to, you know, bring out stories that they don't want to get out, to bring out, you know, for us to bring out. So that, and I think before we talk about the safety measures, I think there's also, I was recently shooting a documentary. One of my friends was shooting a documentary on bully by, and he asked me for a quote. So I said, okay, come over, we'll do it. And I was just sitting there, and my friend asked my mother, you know, Ki, what do you think about her being a journalist? And my mother said that every time she doesn't take her calls, I wonder if she'll come back home. And that was for the first time when I realized that this is the extent to which not just me, but also my loved ones and also my family members are getting affected by, you know, the harassment and the trolling. After the bully bhai thing happened, it was so difficult to have that conversation. But I think a lot of times we tend to undermine the support that our loved ones can give us. So I think as a safety measure and as something to keep us sane, I think it's important to have a sort of support system around you. And if your newsroom has that kind of a support system, which I had the privilege to, you know, experience. Like, I had very good colleagues who supported me throughout this whole mess. So I think that is a really good thing to have. But I do know that a lot of newsrooms do not have these kind of supportive spaces for journalists. So that is something that I think Indian newsrooms have to evolve in a way to sort of look at the present day harassment and trolling and take that into account when thinking about safety measures. Because clearly the safety measures have to change when the threats have changed. So yeah.
So that's very important, and also, like, as I was mentioning, part of the work we at CPJ do, we do a lot of safety workshops, and there are safety manuals. So for example, on Twitter, you would have random people sending you DMs. Now, how do you put in those security filters? Because you can't go and stop every person on earth, right? There's 7 billion people. But you can take a lot of precautions to safeguard yourself. So there are a lot of these things which are these safety tips which are available. And so you can actually reach out to these organizations. Many a times, Internet Freedom Foundation, for example, in Delhi does these workshops. There are laws which you can access, so you can always rule out. I think we are almost out of time, but I can maybe quickly take 2 questions from any, and I will give preference to women journalists here. Yes.
Hello, ma'am. I'm Jyotsna from Christ University. So while we talk of the online space or journalism in general, right, to cover issues related to the safety of women, or not just safety of women, many of the concerns, just like misogyny or patriarchy, we cannot put the onus on women journalists to cover it, because we can't expect them to be okay with talking about things they're traumatized by. But on the other hand, when the men in the male-dominated journalistic space cover it, it comes from the very same patriarchal perspective. So it becomes a loop, right? So how do you think we can deal with that? How do we bring a fair voice in the space?
Correct.
Let's just put one more question so that, we save time. Yes.
Hello, ma'am. I'm Tanisha from Christ University again. And my question to you is, journalists in media do face a lot of hate, a lot of scrutiny, especially female journalists. And there's no distinction drawn between your personal life and your public life. But when media, as a source, slut-shame women, degrade them, and even talk about their personal life to an extent that makes it a show on media, where is the onus on journalists as a whole? And I'm talking about male journalists here, and how do they deal with it, and what should they do to make it a more safer and accessible place for journalists?
So you're saying that the onus is always on women?
No, it's on men. It's on men because it's their world. We can only have the space when they give it, because they're acquiring the space. So they have to make space for the women to come up and take up the space. There is no space for us to go there. They have to create the space, right? So what do they do? What happens in reality?
Correct. So I think, firstly, though, I would like to really say that being a woman journalist has some good bits also. A lot of times, when there are stories which men cannot cover, there are sometimes women in villages will refuse to talk to the men, and that is when I or other women journalists feel like, okay, at least there is some privilege of being a woman journalist. A lot of times, people will not share their emotions with the male journalists because they are not believed to be as sensitive as women are. So these little things are there. These are the silver linings in a lot of mess. So I think the onus, as I said, always sort of ends up being on the woman, because one, I think the woman herself is told, for me, if we take my example, a lot of my senior journalist, friends and colleagues and, seniors who keep telling me, ki, Ismat, you have to play safe, you can't go to this place, you can't. So initially, when somebody would tell me, ki, ye mat pehen ke jana gaon mein, so I would feel very angry. I would feel, why is somebody telling me what I should wear? But after a point, I realized that if you are to fit into a society if you're going to report in a village, you have to go in a certain way, because that is when you will get accepted, and that is when people will speak to you. That is the only way that people will speak to you. Otherwise, you are this outsider and nobody will talk to you. So I think a lot of times the onus is on women, yes, but I think sometimes it does help as well. Like I said, you tend to sort of mix up with the society. You tend to, get more access to women, specifically in villages and rural areas, which is not something that men get to do a lot. So I think I would just like to end this session by saying that it's not, women being in journalism is not all dangers and, threats and all of that. There is also some, good bits to it. And to every woman who's sitting here, I would really every young woman who's sitting here, I would really encourage you to read as much as you can, take as many safety precautions, but don't censor yourself. Don't think कि मुझे ये नहीं करना है क्योंकि कोई नहीं चाहता है, मुझे नहीं करना है. If you want to do something, if you want to do the journalism, you go ahead and you do it. So.
Thank you so much, and thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, Kunal. You were wonderful.
Oh, thank you. We're done.
Thanks, Kunal. Thanks, Ismat. Can I have Azad Singh on the stage? So it's just a small thing, Azad will give you a small little memento, and then we introduce the next two speakers. Azad?